There is an old saying in the coal towns of southwestern Pennsylvania, worn smooth from passing through so many mouths that nobody remembers who first said it. The ground keeps what the living forget. It is the kind of thing people carve on fence posts and then stop thinking about, because carving it feels like enough. Vera Mossbach thought about it constantly. She thought about it the way you think about a stone in your boot, present at every step, not yet painful enough to stop and remove, but never quite absent either. She thought about it in October of 1989, when she moved back into her grandmother's house on Culver Hill Road, with a single station wagon full of belongings and a 9-year-old shepherd mix named Cato, who had been with her through 2 apartments, 1 bad marriage, and a foreclosure that still made her jaw tighten when she signed her name to anything. The house had been empty for 11 months. The estate lawyer, a soft-handed man named Grigg, who wore a different color of the same necktie every time she saw him, told her she was making a mistake by keeping it. He told her this in the parking lot of his office, in a kindly way that was somehow more insulting than if he had shouted it. "The house needs more than you can give it," he said. "These old properties become sinkholes, financially speaking." He smiled when he said financially speaking, as if the phrase were doing him a favor by arriving. Vera thanked him. She drove to Culver Hill Road. She did not think about him again until she had reason to. The house was a wide-shouldered, 2-story frame structure built in 1901 by her great-grandfather, Emmerich Mossbach, who had come from Moravia in 1888 with a box of carpenter's tools and a suspicion of banks that his granddaughter had inherited completely. The clapboards were a faded ochre. The porch sagged at the north end, where a support post had rotted through, and the kitchen ceiling had a brown stain, the shape of a splayed hand from a pipe that had wept and dried and wept again over 40 years. Vera cataloged all of it without self-pity. She had a pension from the county records office where she had worked for 19 years, a small sum from the sale of the foreclosed house after the bank took its portion, and a talent for silence that most people in her life had mistaken for sadness. It was not sadness. It was attention. There is a difference, though the two are easy to confuse from the outside. She began in the basement the first week of November, not because the basement was the most urgent thing, though it needed work, but because Cato went to the basement door on the second night and sat in front of it with his ears forward and his tail absolutely still. And Vera had learned over 9 years that Cato's stillness was a different quality of attention than his ordinary watching. She opened the door. He descended the stairs ahead of her in the careful, deliberate way of a dog who is not afraid but is being precise. The basement was unfinished, dirt-floored, low-ceilinged, with a coal furnace that had not been used since the mid-1960s, when Vera's grandmother had installed an oil burner, and rough stone walls laid without mortar in the fashion of that era, each stone fitted to its neighbor by eye and by the pressure of what lay above. There was a workbench along the east wall, a rusted hand pump that connected to nothing Vera could trace, and in the southwest corner, a wooden shelving unit filled with mason jars of preserved vegetables, so old they had gone the color of old photographs. Cato walked to the northwest corner and put his nose to the floor and breathed. He did this every night for a year, not frantically, not with the anxious, circular digging of a dog who smells a mouse. He came to that corner the way a person comes to a window to look at weather, steadily, with a settled sense of purpose, and he breathed along the packed earth and then began, with great patience, to excavate. By morning, he would have moved perhaps a shovelful. By the end of the first week, there was a shallow bowl in the dirt, roughly 2 feet across. Vera watched him and noted the direction of his interest, and said nothing to the several people who offered opinions. The first to offer one was her neighbor, Dale Purcell, who owned the property to the south and who came over in mid-November with a casserole and a concern. He stood at the kitchen door in his canvas work coat and looked down at the dirt on Cato's forelegs and said that a dog digging in a basement was often a sign of vermin or of a cracked sewer line, and that she ought to have someone come out and inspect before she found herself with a real problem. He said the word inspect the way people say it when they mean the person inspecting will find something expensive. Vera said she would keep it in mind. She thanked him for the casserole. He left, and she stood at the window and watched his truck reverse down the lane and thought, he's probably right about the sewer line. And then she went downstairs and looked at the corner and thought, but that is not what this is. She had no evidence for this. She had only the quality of Cato's attention, which she trusted more than she trusted Dale Purcell's alarm, and a growing habit of looking at her great-grandmother's commonplace book, which she had found in a shoebox at the back of a bedroom closet, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had dried to the texture of birch bark. The commonplace book was a small, cloth-covered ledger, its pages dense with entries in a cramped, forward-leaning script that mixed practical notes with observations of a more personal character. There were recipes. There were weather records. There were remarks about neighbors that were so precise and so uncharitable that Vera sometimes laughed aloud reading them in her empty kitchen. And there was, near the back of the book in entries that spanned September and October of 1918, a sequence of passages that Vera read and reread until she had them by heart. The first said, "Emmerich has walled in the room again. He says it is not safe to leave it open with the sickness moving through Connellsville the way it is. I think he is hiding his mind from me on this subject, which is a thing he does. I think he has put something in the room that he does not wish examined." The second said, "I asked him what is in the room, and he said the machinery. I did not ask which machinery because with Emmerich there is always a machinery that explains everything and means nothing." The third, undated, said simply, "He sealed the door with mortar this afternoon. He worked alone. He told me it was for the best. I wrote down the measurements as best I could from watching. 22 steps south from the coal furnace flue and then left-hand wall, approximately 8 feet of clearance to the corner." Vera stood at the coal furnace flue in November of 1989 and counted 22 paces south and turned and looked at the northwest corner where Cato breathed his nightly prayers into the packed earth floor, and she felt the hair along her forearms lift in the way that is not fear, but its first cousin. And she went upstairs and made coffee and sat with the commonplace book until it was very late. She told no one about the book for several months. Not because she was secretive by nature, though she was private, but because she understood without quite articulating it that the information was not yet useful. She had a compass bearing and a distance. She did not yet have a plan, or rather she had a plan, and it was the simplest possible one, which was to let Cato work and to work alongside him, and to excavate the corner by measured degrees without disturbing what might be behind the wall, if there was a wall, and without announcing herself to people who would want to manage what she found. The winter was useful for this because no one visited much. December and January she spent reinforcing the porch support post with a new 6x6 that she cut and set herself, which gave her a pretext for having lumber and tools visible, so that when Dale Purcell or his wife Lynette looked over from the road, they saw a woman doing what old houses require, and did not wonder too specifically about what else she was doing. She worked in the basement in the mornings, after Cato's nightly excavation, clearing the soil he had loosened and extending the excavation along the wall. She worked carefully. She used a wide masonry chisel to probe the wall face wherever she exposed new stone, and she kept a paper log of what she found. The character of the stone, the character of the mortar between courses where there was mortar, and in two places the absence of mortar where she had expected it. By February, she had opened a trench along the northwest wall 18 inches deep and 6 feet long. The stones in that section were laid differently from those in the rest of the basement. In the rest of the basement, the stones were set in rough, horizontal courses, with the broad faces outward. In this section, the stones were set with their narrow faces outward, like books shelved spine out, which Vera's great-grandmother had not noted in the commonplace book, but which Vera understood immediately. It was a facing. Behind it was something else. She did not pull the facing stones. Not yet. She sat on the earthen floor with her back against the coal furnace and Cato's head in her lap, and she looked at the wall and said, in the way she said most things that mattered, which was quietly and without preamble, "We are going to have to be careful about this." Cato closed his eyes. She was careful. Through February and into March, she reinforced the basement ceiling joists above the trench with temporary shoring because she did not know what the facing wall was carrying, and she did not want to learn by having the floor above her collapse. She used adjustable steel columns she rented from a tool hire place in Uniontown, driving there on a Thursday morning when the roads were clear of ice. The man at the counter looked at her order form and said, "You doing some excavation?" She said she was shoring up some deteriorated joists. He said that made sense. He loaded the columns into her wagon without further comment, which she appreciated. The shoring went in over 2 evenings. She torqued the columns up to a firm pressure against the joists and marked each one with a felt pen to check for any settlement. Then she returned to the facing wall and began, stone by stone, to remove it. The facing was 3 courses thick. Each stone she lifted free and stacked in a row along the east wall, with the same methodical patience she had applied to 19 years of county records. Each one accounted for, each one handled once, placed where it would not need to be moved again. Cato sat at the head of the trench and watched. The work took 11 days, working a few hours each morning. On the morning of the 12th day, she removed the last stone of the 3rd course, and the beam of her work light fell through the gap and onto a space that was not the rubble she had half expected. It was a room. It was small, roughly 8 feet wide and perhaps 14 feet long, with a poured concrete floor that had never been finished smooth but was solid and dry. The walls were dressed fieldstone laid with lime mortar, and they were sound, uncracked, clean of any significant moisture staining. The ceiling was the underside of the first floor above, heavy joists with the bark still on them in places, the way they had been dressed in 1901 when Emmerich Mossbach built the house. There was a wooden shelf along the far wall supported on wrought iron brackets, and on the shelf there were 14 objects arranged with what could only have been deliberate care. Vera stood at the opening for a long time. Then she went upstairs and poured herself a cup of the coffee that was still warm from the morning, and she sat at the kitchen table, and she opened the commonplace book to the undated entry, and she read it again. He sealed the door with mortar this afternoon. He worked alone. He told me it was for the best. She said to the empty kitchen, "Emmerich, you strange man." Then she finished her coffee, put on her old canvas apron, and went back down to see what he had considered worth walling away. The 14 objects on the shelf broke down as follows. There were 3 wooden tool cases, latched, of the kind used by instrument makers and surveyors. There were 2 ledger books bound in dark leather, their spines unlettered. There was a folded wool blanket that had compressed to a hard, flat shape over 70 years. There were 4 stoppered glass jars containing substances that were dry and unidentifiable at a glance. There was a small, framed, tintype photograph of a man and a woman standing before this house. The man, very tall, the woman, very small, both looking at the camera with the total seriousness that early photography required. There was a document in a flat tin case with a hinged lid. And there was, mounted on 2 wrought iron hooks on the far wall, in a position of evident honor, a device that Vera recognized after a moment's study as a mining survey instrument. A hanging compass in a brass housing with a spirit level set into the base, its needle still moving slightly when she came close, as if it had been waiting. Vera Mossbach had worked for 19 years in the county records office. She understood documents, and she understood chains of title, and she understood the maps that showed what lay beneath the ground of southwestern Pennsylvania, with a precision that most people living above that ground never thought to acquire. She sat on the concrete floor of the sealed room and opened the first ledger book and read for 2 hours without moving. Emmerich Mossbach, carpenter and sometime surveyor, had spent the years between 1901 and 1918 conducting an unauthorized but highly systematic survey of the mineral rights situation underneath Culver Hill and the surrounding ridgeline. He had done this because he had observed in 1899, while working on a construction crew for a coal operator named Whitmore, that the surface boundaries of Whitmore's holdings did not correspond to the underground boundaries, as he understood them from older maps, which he had been copying and studying in the evenings at the Connellsville Library. He had continued this study after building his own house. He had corresponded, discreetly, with 2 other former crew members who had noticed the same discrepancy. He had surveyed by night using his hanging compass and a chain and a level and a meticulous log of every measurement, and he had concluded by 1914 that Whitmore's company had been mining coal from beneath at least 3 surface parcels, whose mineral rights had never been legally conveyed to Whitmore, including the parcel on which Emmerich's own house stood. He had not acted on this conclusion. He had sealed it instead in the autumn of 1918, when the influenza was moving through the valley and he was 61 years old and not certain he would survive it, and when the power of the coal operators felt to him, as it felt to most men in that valley in that year, like a geological force rather than a human one. He had sealed it. He had not destroyed it. The document in the flat tin case was a 31-page affidavit, signed by Emmerich and notarized by a notary in Uniontown whose seal was still legible, summarizing the survey findings and their legal implications. Emmerich had survived the influenza. He had lived until 1941. He had never opened the room. Vera sat with this for a long time. She did not jump to conclusions. She went upstairs and called the county records office, where she still knew every person who answered the phone, and she asked whether the mineral rights records for the Culver Hill area going back to 1890 were still in the archive. They were. She drove to the office on a Wednesday in early March and spent a day with the records and confirmed what Emmerich had concluded and updated it by 70 years of subsequent transfers and mergers and bankruptcies that he could not have anticipated. The coal company that had descended from Whitmore's operation had gone through 3 reorganizations and had been acquired in 1971 by a regional energy firm called Palliser Resources, which was publicly traded and which had, in 1985, transferred those same disputed mineral rights as part of a collateral package to a Pittsburgh bank called Conover Merchant, which had used them as the basis for a series of loans. The loans were performing. The mineral rights were listed on Conover Merchant's books as a clean, unencumbered asset. They were not clean. They had never been legally conveyed. The original surface owner, Whitmore's predecessor, had sold the surface parcels in the 1890s with a standard deed that conveyed everything, surface and mineral, because in that era, most small landowners did not yet know to sever the two, and Whitmore had simply begun mining without ever obtaining a proper conveyance of the mineral estate. The error had been papered over by subsequent transfers that assumed the first conveyance existed. It did not. Emmerich had known it did not. He had written 31 pages explaining exactly why. Vera drove home from the records office and sat in her kitchen with Cato on the floor beside her, and she thought carefully for 3 days. She was not a lawyer. She understood, however, that what she was holding was a legal instrument signed by a man who was dead, pointing to a defect in a chain of title that had been accumulating compound interest in other people's confidence for 71 years. She called a property attorney in Pittsburgh named Sylvia Anrath, whose name she had encountered in a professional directory in the records office, because Sylvia Anrath had once done a quiet title action involving mineral rights in Fayette County and had won it. Vera explained what she had in general terms over the telephone. Sylvia Anrath was silent for a moment and then said, "Do not show this to anyone else yet." Vera said she had not. Sylvia Anrath said she would drive out on Saturday. She did. She sat at Vera's kitchen table with the tin case open in front of her and read for 90 minutes while Vera made soup. Then Sylvia Anrath set the affidavit down and said, "And you found this where exactly?" Vera described the room. Sylvia Anrath sat back in her chair. She said, "Your great-grandfather was a very careful man." Vera said, "Yes, he was a carpenter." Sylvia Anrath said that was evident from the organization of the documentation. Then she said, "This is going to take time. Are you in a financial position to wait?" Vera said she had her pension and the house, and she was not in any particular hurry. Sylvia Anrath said, "Good." She closed the tin case and put her hands flat on the table and said, "Then let us begin." What followed was not a dramatic legal battle in any cinematic sense. It was paperwork. It was long, methodical, unglamorous paperwork of precisely the kind that Vera had been doing in one form or another for 19 years, and she was good at it. Sylvia Anrath filed a quiet title action in Fayette County Common Pleas Court in the spring of 1990. The action named Conover Merchant Bank and its predecessors in interest, and argued that the mineral rights listed on the bank's books as collateral had never been validly conveyed in the first place, and therefore the entire downstream chain of title was void. The bank's attorneys, who were very expensive and very confident, filed a motion to dismiss. The motion was denied. They filed a motion for summary judgment. It was denied. The matter went to a hearing in the autumn of 1991. During the 26 months between the filing and the hearing, Vera continued to fix the house. This is not a digression. She fixed the house the way she did everything, methodically, without drama, room by room. The porch post was already done. She replastered the kitchen ceiling, replaced the rotted sill plates on the north wall, repointed the exterior chimney, stripped and refinished the pine floors in the 2 front rooms. She kept the basement dry with a new sump pump she installed herself after watching a plumbing tutorial on a VHS cassette twice. She maintained the sealed room as it was, cataloging every object on the shelf in a typed inventory that she kept in a manila folder in the kitchen cabinet next to the coffee. Dale Purcell came over in the spring of 1990 and saw the new siding she had put up on the north face of the house and said it looked very good and that it was admirable that she was putting the work in, but that she might want to consider at some point whether the house was the right long-term investment given the neighborhood's trajectory. He used the word trajectory with the mild authority of a man who had heard it recently and liked it. Vera said she planned to stay. Dale Purcell nodded in the particular way that means, "I disagree, but I will not argue with you about your own choices." He went back across the lane. In June of 1990, a woman named Odette Frick, who ran the local historical society from a Victorian storefront in town, came out to the house because she had heard from someone, probably Dale Purcell's wife Lynette, that Vera had found some old items in the basement. Odette Frick was a small, enthusiastic woman with a large, scarlet coat and an earnest certainty that everything old that came to light in Fayette County was, at minimum, museum-worthy. She sat in Vera's kitchen and leaned forward and said she would love to see whatever Vera had found, because the Historical Society had a display case that would be just perfect, and she could offer a very small honorarium for the donation of any objects of community significance. Vera poured her coffee and said that there was nothing yet ready to be shown, but that she would keep the Historical Society in mind. Odette Frick looked briefly disappointed, and then rallied and said, "Well, of course, whenever you are ready, and there is no rush," and she left her card on the table where it sat for 11 months before Vera recycled it. The woman who came and said nothing useful and then stayed was named Ruth Ann Decker. She arrived in October of 1990 in a 20-year-old Ford pickup with a cracked windshield and a surveying transit in the bed, and she knocked on the door and said she had heard that Vera was doing a mineral rights case in this township, and that she was a land surveyor, recently retired from the State Geological Survey, and that if there was survey work to be done, she would like to help. She said all of this standing on the porch with her hands in her pockets and her chin slightly raised, not aggressively, but in the manner of a person accustomed to making a case to people who were not expecting her. Vera looked at her for a moment and said, "Come in." Ruth Ann came in. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at Emmerich's survey logs and the maps Vera had accumulated from the records office, and she said nothing for 15 minutes. Then she said, "His chain measurements are off by about 3%. Probably instrument calibration, but his angular work is very good. He knew what he was doing." Vera said she thought so too. Ruth Ann said she could run a fresh survey using modern GPS equipment that would either confirm or refine Emmerich's conclusions, and that this kind of contemporary corroboration would be useful in court. Vera said, "What do you charge?" Ruth Ann said nothing. She had her pension, and she was bored with retirement. And this was interesting. Vera said, "All right." Ruth Ann drove home and came back 2 days later with her equipment, and they worked together for 3 weekends in October and November. Ruth Ann running lines across the ridge while Vera held the rod and marked flagging and kept notes. And they did not talk very much, but they understood each other without needing to. The survey confirmed Emmerich's conclusions with the calibration corrected. The discrepancy between the claimed and actual underground boundaries was significant. A strip of coal-bearing strata approximately 460 feet wide and nearly a mile long beneath 3 surface parcels, one of which was Vera's. Ruth Ann's report joined Emmerich's affidavit in the tin case and then was filed with the court. The hearing in the autumn of 1991 lasted 3 days. Vera attended all 3. She sat at the plaintiff's table with Sylvia Anrath and answered questions when asked in the flat, factual manner she had answered questions for 19 years in the county records office. And she did not elaborate when she did not need to, and she did not display anger at the bank's attorneys when they implied that her great-grandfather's document was a forgery or a curiosity, or a legally irrelevant relic of a different era of property law. The notary's seal and registration records confirmed the date. Ruth Ann's modern survey confirmed the underlying factual claim. The title chain, traced by Sylvia Anrath with the same methodical patience that Emmerich had used to construct his affidavit, contained no valid conveyance of the mineral rights at its root. The judge took 2 weeks and ruled for Vera on the central claim. The mineral rights to the relevant strip of strata had never been validly conveyed away from the original surface parcels. They had, by operation of the original deeds and Pennsylvania property law, descended with the surface to the current surface owners, of whom Vera was one. The bank appealed. The appeal took 14 months and was denied. Vera learned of the denial on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1993 when Sylvia Anrath called. She said, "Congratulations," and Vera said, "Thank you." She set the phone back in the cradle and sat at the kitchen table with Cato, who was 12 years old now, and moved slowly, but still came to the basement door most nights to stand and breathe toward the northwest corner. Though Vera had long since cleared the corner and opened the sealed room and cleaned and cataloged its contents. The room was open now, lit by a string of shop lights Vera had run from the main panel. She had put a small rug on the concrete floor and a camp stool in the corner. She went down there sometimes to read. The resolution of the mineral rights claim did not make Vera wealthy. The coal beneath those parcels had been substantially extracted between 1899 and the 1940s. What remained was a residual interest that the subsequent operators had not considered worth working, and which in any case was subject to environmental regulations that made further extraction costly. The value was not in extraction. The value was in the encumbrance. Conover Merchant Bank had listed those mineral rights as a clean collateral asset on loans totaling slightly over $2 million. Those loans did not fail because of the ruling, but the collateral had to be written down and renegotiated, and the bank's ability to use that particular asset in further transactions was eliminated. And there was a period of several months in which Vera received calls from lawyers representing various parties to those loan agreements who wanted to discuss the situation. She referred them all to Sylvia Anrath. What she received directly was this: a settlement payment from Conover Merchant of $68,000 in exchange for a covenant not to sue for historical trespass, which Sylvia Anrath advised her to accept. And she did. She also received, from the title insurance company that had been insuring the bank's mineral rights position, a separate payment of $22,000 for the same reason. The total was $90,000. Vera was 54 years old in 1993. She had her pension. The house, by this point, was in the best structural condition it had been in since Emmerich built it. She was not hungry. She spent $31,000 of the settlement on the house, a new roof, a proper heating system to replace the aged oil burner, and a complete regrading of the yard to move drainage away from the foundation, which she had been meaning to do since she moved in. She spent $12,000 having the mineral rights issue on the neighboring parcels researched and communicated to the other surface owners, most of whom had no idea they might have a comparable claim. 2 of them pursued it and recovered smaller settlements. She asked nothing from them for the information. Dale Purcell was one of them. He came to her door in the summer of 1994 after he had spoken to his own lawyer, which he had done after Vera sent him a short, factual letter explaining what she had found, and what it might mean for his parcel. He stood on her newly repaired porch with his hat in his hands, and he said he wanted to thank her. She could see that thanking her was costing him something. She said it was no trouble. He said he did not understand why she would do that. She said because the information was there and it was his by right. He stood there for another moment, and then he said, "I should have kept my mouth shut about the investment trajectory." Vera said she had not thought about it. She was telling the truth. She donated the hanging compass and the tintype photograph and 2 of Emmerich's survey logs to the Historical Society in 1994. Odette Frick, who was still running the society and still wore the scarlet coat, received them with enormous warmth and displayed them in a case with a placard that described Emmerich Mosbach as a surveyor and builder who had quietly documented a significant irregularity in the mineral rights history of the Connellsville Basin, the full significance of which was not recognized until his great-granddaughter Vera returned to the family property in 1989. The placard was accurate. Vera read it once when Odette Frick walked her through the display at a small opening the society held, and she said that it read well. Odette Frick said she had worked hard on it, and had Vera any changes? Vera said no. Ruth Ann Decker came to the opening. She stood next to the display case with a glass of the mediocre wine the Historical Society provided and looked at Emmerich's photograph for a long while. She said he had good hands. She could tell by the way he stood. Vera said he had been a carpenter first. Ruth Ann said it showed. She looked at the hanging compass on its hooks. She said it was a beautiful instrument. He must have saved a long time for it. Vera said she thought so. The 2 of them stood there in a comfortable quiet that was by then habitual between them. Ruth Ann had continued coming out to the house on weekends through 1992 and 1993, helping with the grading project and the roof, working with the same deliberate competence she brought to everything. She lived 20 minutes away. She had a truck and tools and a board retirement and an attention span that matched Vera's own. By 1994, she had a key. Cato died in January of 1995. He was 14 years old, which for a dog of his size was old in the way that matters, a rounding off. He went to the basement door on the last night of his life and stood in front of it with his ears forward and his tail still. And Vera opened it, and he descended the stairs for the last time in the deliberate, precise way he had always done. And he went to the northwest corner of the sealed room where the floor was still softer than the surrounding concrete from his years of night work. And he lay down, and he did not get up again. Vera sat with him until it was over. The room was lit by the shop lights. The wool blanket that Emmerich had left on the shelf was folded under Cato's head, which Vera had put there because it was the only soft thing in the room, and because it seemed right that something of Emmerich's should be there. She did not find this sentimental. She found it logical. She buried him in the yard on the south side of the house where the ground was warmest, soonest in spring, and she marked the place with a flat field stone she took from the stack she had removed from the facing wall. On the stone, using a masonry chisel that had belonged to Emmerich, she cut 4 words. She did not agonize over them. She had known what they would be since she first watched him breathe along the dirt of that corner in November of 1989, with his ears forward and his whole body arranged in that attitude of patient, certain knowledge. The words she cut were these: he knew where to look. She ran one hand over them when she was done, and the lettering was plain and clean, which satisfied her. The County Historical Society republished Emmerich's survey logs in 1997 as part of a broader project on the mineral rights history of the Connellsville Basin. The project was funded partly by a small grant and partly by a donation from Vera, who was listed in the acknowledgments as a private donor. The introduction to the published logs described Emmerich's work as a remarkable example of systematic lay scholarship conducted under conditions of significant social risk and preserved against all odds through the decision of one careful person to seal it rather than surrender it or destroy it, and through the decision of another careful person, 71 years later, to trust an old dog's nose over a neighbor's confidence. The sealed room is still there. Vera did not fill it back in, and she did not dramatically renovate it. She put a proper door on the opening where the stone facing had been, a plain wooden door on wrought iron hinges that she made herself from bar stock, following a pattern she found in one of Emmerich's tool cases, because it seemed he had meant to put a door there and had never gotten to it. The room holds the remaining survey instruments, the ledger books in their leather bindings, and a shelf of Vera's own records, the paper log she kept during the excavation, the typed inventory of the room's contents, copies of all the court filings organized in the same flat manila folders she had used in the county records office, and a copy of the Historical Society's published survey logs, with a note tucked inside the front cover in Vera's handwriting that says, "To whoever finds this, the original document is in the county courthouse archive, accession number 1992-CR-0047. Start there. The commonplace book is there too. It is in its oilcloth wrapper. The entry near the back says what it has always said. He sealed the door with mortar this afternoon. He worked alone. He told me it was for the best. It was, in the end, for the best." Emmerich had known what he was putting away and why. He had wrapped it not in mysticism or prophecy, but in wrought iron and poured concrete and 31 pages of notarized fact. And he had trusted that time and the ground and someone paying the right kind of attention would do the rest. The ground had kept it. The ground keeps what the living forget, and sometimes what the living are not yet ready to use, and sometimes what the living need to seal away until someone comes along who has both the patience to uncover it and the good sense to know what it means. Vera Mossbach turned 72 in 2011. Ruth Ann was 68. They walked the ridge behind Culver Hill that October with a young woman named Petra, who was a graduate student in historical geography at the University of Pittsburgh and who was writing her thesis on the relationship between lay surveying practices and mineral rights litigation in early 20th century Western Pennsylvania. Petra walked between them and asked careful questions and wrote the answers in a field notebook with the wire spiral on top. And Vera watched her write and thought that the notebook was the right instinct, to write it down, to keep the record, to trust that the record would survive its author. She did not say this. She looked out across the ridge at the stand of oaks on the far slope and the gray November sky beginning to come in from the west. Ruth Ann pointed to a rock outcrop and explained its geological significance to Petra in the patient, exact manner she brought to all explanations. Cato's fieldstone marker was visible from the ridge, just barely, a pale rectangle at the south side of the house, and Vera could read the words on it from memory without being able to see them. He knew where to look. That is the whole of it, to know where to look, and to look there steadily, and to trust the knowledge when the confident people around you are explaining at length and with great warmth why you are mistaken, and when the ground tells you something different than what the loud world is saying. To listen to the ground, because the ground keeps what the living forget, and it does not lie, and it will wait as long as it needs to.